Hello everyone, today we talk about the role of mainly Ukrainian ethnic communities during World War II and between the Nazis and the Soviets, and the relation in general between the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Jews, the Germans largely, and then of course we will pass at some point to the Soviet period more in depth. And as we were saying in the last video, the existence of a second Polish Republic had allowed the space, the room for some degree of Ukrainian political activism, generally aimed at getting more prerogatives within the Polish state. The most active political groups were minoritary. The majority of Ukrainians fundamentally didn't care more than much about the idea, for example, of contesting the idea of a Polish rule properly meant. There was just essentially a veteran and an intelligentsia element that pushed the most for the creation of a Ukrainian state, and that's mostly where the greatest efforts were made. Most of these people were connected, at least in general, to the organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. That was this group that fundamentally carried out also some attacks against the Polish officials and the Ukrainian, say, collaborators from their perspective. But overall, the interwar period had been fundamentally stable, both in Galicia and Volhynia, where prevalence of the prevalent ethnic group was Ukrainian, as a matter of fact. And it's important to stress how much the Polish state at that point had kept things together and had, again, been the precondition for these things to even happen, because Ukrainians claimed actually some greater, ethnographic space that mostly included those territories that were framed within the Soviet Ukraine that had been, however, fundamentally ravaged by famine, if not properly genocide, as a matter of fact. And Ukrainians wouldn't have any other neighbor that would be sympathetic to their cause, right? They would mostly look at the Germans, and as we will see, they would be disappointed once the Nazis arrived. But in general, there was kind of a greater cooperation with them at that point, because again, that had become the new state. But there are subtler reasons that are not simply, the prevalence of a nationalist hatred, etc. And and of course, it was this, increasing understanding that also the Soviet experience was would have been disappointing, and this was, especially after the Holodomor, etc. But again, the masses were somewhat unaware of this broader international issues, right? They would know, they would understand there was also a communist presence among Ukrainians that was, in fact, across the border, especially with the Soviet Volhynian one, was fueled actively by Stalin. But it is properly the destruction of Poland in 1939 that brought the main ethnic, let's say, claims and tensions to rise, because at that point the Polish state was effectively disappeared, right? And as such, there was a greater opportunity than before, at least apparently, in the mess that was taking place, and that was putting even those Ukrainian independentists who wanted to create a state in front of challenges that were evidently more serious, like in the creation of a state properly than it is just protesting, right, or even carrying out terrorism, things like these, that would complicate the situation. So, as you know, Poland was occupied both by the Nazis and the Soviets. So the general presumption that there should be kind of a Polish rule in the land disappeared simply by itself, by this major international change. And that's only properly at that point that Ukrainian masses, for the first time, in these in the let's say in Galicia and Volhynia, that had pioneered this independentistic cause, began properly to to realize the possibility, like the say the discussing even properly the legitimacy eventually of another Polish rule, because this had disappeared. They were there, they were the majority. What to do now? After all, it was only 16 years that the Polish rule had stabilized the eastern, the Polish-Soviet border with the Entente, and so those Ukrainian soldiers that had fought in 1918, 1919 in West Ukrainian-Polish wars, that were fundamentally, they had seen their attempt of creation of Ukrainian state destroyed by the Polish army, were still active, militarily speaking. This is a very, I mean, they were still in age where they could be, in fact, used, and it would be used. Militarily speaking, this is a very often overlooked aspect of the Second World War in general, that, many people who were still capable of fighting because they had already done it and knew how to do it, were still in their prime and could mobilize in that fashion. So the let's say Ukrainian national activists were mostly concentrated in Galicia and Volhynia, and they felt that the time had come, but their expectations would be soon frustrated by totalitarianism. Of course, the most active individuals that in the construction of an establishment of a Ukrainian state had been the ones who had been taken the Polish rule in more extremistic ways, right? Seeing it as an occupation. For the rest, however, the big game changer, quantitatively speaking, is that also those Ukrainians, or people of Ukrainian culture, because as we've seen, there were also Poles actually speaking Ukrainian or living next to Ukrainians and Jews without many problems at all, began to see at this point, well, somebody had taken away the Polish state, no specific reason for which a Polish state should be reestablished in the first place, right? Which definitely was, was a game changer in terms of perspective, and thus albeit the organization of Ukrainian nationalists was had been awaiting this moment, the change was so big in a sense. Naturally, there were somebody that had filled, let's say, the gap left empty by the Polish state, that was not particularly interested in a real Ukrainian independence. All the difficulties of creating such state emerged, right? You had pushed with this rhetoric all the time from an extremistic perspective, saying build a Ukrainian state, and then what happens when, at least there may be, apparently, because the Poles are the problem, right? Those who had extremistically taken it in that direction. Now the Poles are not there anymore. There are even some sides that you have supported in a way, because the nationalists had mostly looked at Germany as a helper, the communists to the Soviets, and both sides immediately realized that it was better when Poland was there, of course. And so consider that establishing a state is a big problem in general, because it makes you lose definitely allies all around, and especially the most dangerous ones in terms properly of proximity and possibility of intervention in the area, right? And so what would be actually fueled by the collapse of the Polish state was not much the establishment of a Ukrainian reality. As we'll see, Ukrainians would be actually co-opted by, the Nazis and the administration and so on. But as a matter of fact, it was still an occupation, and even more evidently than before. And therefore, what actually was inflated was the use of the need to resort to revolutionary means, right? This was not present just among Ukrainians at that point, but also by Poles. The Polish resistance that at that point was fighting not just against mostly the Nazis, because eventually, for a brief time, especially in Galicia and Volhynia, those were areas, as we've seen, had fallen in the hands of the Soviets. But for many years after 1941, we're talking about the Nazi occupation mostly, and with the Soviets coming back later. So a mess, a total mess, and revolutionary ideas are somewhat dangerous, bold. They make you risk more, in a sense, even ideologically speaking, because they require a kind of more extremistic tension in the first place. And Ukrainian nationalists had a reason to cooperate with the Nazis, right? Given that, as we've seen in other videos, the main power that would work at the detriment of Poland was Germany, right? So originally, again, always in a Galician and Volhynian perspective, because in the Soviet one the situation was dramatic and much worse. And would help, in fact, originally also to get consensus there for the Germans. We're hoping that supporting the Nazi regime, Ukraine would have had a chance for independence over the Poles in the area. As we will see, the Nazis would essentially instrumentalize this, right, and would turn, even purposely, for the sake of creating a Lebensraum, the Ukrainians and the Poles against each other, artificially, right? There were already reasons, of course, for that ethnic tension was producing themselves, but the Nazis, even at the cost of some further destabilization of their Eastern European policy, they would carry that out without any scruple. So the main deal, of course, with Galicia and Volhynia is that Ukrainians wanted at that point to establish a new state that would include these lands at the expense of the previously held Polish territories, that would, in this sense, homogenize properly ethnically the local populace, right? And this conflicted naturally with the Polish perspective that was still, politically active, even under the Nazi occupation, to restore Poland within its borders of 1939, especially after the Operation Barbarossa, for that matter. So that had brought under German control basically all the formerly held Polish territory. So the Poles were naturally suspicious of what the Ukrainians, broadly speaking, were doing, because they realized now that without their subtle control, it would have been, as we've seen, easier even for the masses to say simply, okay, well, now Poland is over, it's under somebody else's control. Let's see if we can gain something. And interestingly enough, when the Wehrmacht had marched in the Ukrainian villages in September 1939, the locals had greeted them with bread and salt. So in the General Gouvernement, that was essentially there was properly a Ukrainian, let's call it in this way, state was created by the Nazis, with Volhynia essentially, and great part what was essentially had been Soviet Ukraine after 1941, and then the General Gouvernement said that was essentially Galicia and the Polish territories that would be today's southeastern Poland, that were grouped together. So that was an interesting move. As we will see, there was still the Germans didn't quite do this to placate ethnic tensions at all. In some ways, they inflated them themselves, especially as time progressed. And interestingly enough, in this partition, this Generalgouvernement, the surplus of educated Ukrainians found visibly rewarding careers as journalists, teachers, professors, and bureaucrats. So this included Galicia, as we've seen, was definitely, like, compared to Polish lands, was more backwards, let's say, but it still was the best in terms of Ukrainian intelligentsia that the Poles had excluded during the Second Polish Republic from the local administration, because there had been nobody, nor a minister, nor a local governor, that hadn't been a Pole, even in the not just in the ethnically prevalent Ukrainian areas, but also, I don't know, in the Lithuanian ones. This is interesting because it brought finally to the fore some Ukrainian elites in the area, right, that cooperated thus for their own interest with the German authorities that ruled the country. And this was naturally intolerable for the Poles, because, you know, there was an armed resistance against the Germans already, and this shifted, in a sense, as a venting valve, also Polish violence attacks, not much against the Germans that would retaliate in very harsh fashion, but rather against Ukrainians, because the same German authorities at that point were kind of not interested, right? You know, if there had been an attack to a Wehrmacht unit, the Germans would have massacred whoever would have persecuted whoever had carried it out, or even more. If somebody had killed a Ukrainian under German authority, well, this was not, under Ukrainians under German government, this the Germans wouldn't quite care the same way, especially if they knew there had been the Poles to do that. Now consider, as we were saying before, that the Germans considered the Slavs as an inferior race, right? So we're not talking about a normal political rationale. There was a very specific plan to eventually get rid of both, right, of all the Slavs at some point. And so this kind of worked, right, to the achievement of that. So that's why this, as bizarre as it sounds, but was actually possible. The point in many ways is that, as you know, the Germans didn't carry out a mass extermination of the Slavs in this context, like they did with the Jews, for example, because they didn't have time. Eventually they lost the war, but the ultimate goal, right, was probably exterminating all these people and filling Eastern Europe with Germans, right? And this alienated great part of the sympathies from all these masses that, especially on the Eastern Front, could actually contribute significantly to the Axis effort against the Red Army. Because of this insanity, but paradoxically, this was not entirely known at the beginning, right? It's very instructive to watch even some interviews about, I don't know, YouTube is plenty of beautiful ones about the Holocaust, Holocaust survivors, especially that tell you really living in Poland, sometimes the same Jews. The Jews could be, like in the Polish state, could be ferociously discriminated against as much as kind of coexisting. It depended on the area, right, in interwar Poland, really. And so, like, there were many, okay, let's not digress on this because it's very interesting, but maybe make a video on its own. But nobody really understood that. Not even, as we will see now, the Jews who inhabited Poland or the Soviet Union actually understood that the Germans would actually take them out the way they did, right? On the contrary, at the beginning, because the Jews suffered terribly under the Soviet Union as well, so they would even think that, after all, the Germans, as a more civilized people, would, generally speaking, be more would bring a better rule, at least, right? The Jews had already to endure quite a lot in the past that would have not been really, literally the worst would have ever happened to them. Instead, they were wrong, unfortunately. So there was a different perspective also on collaboration in this sense, because Ukrainians, for example, those Ukrainians who welcomed the Soviets in 1939, in part because some of them were socialists, as we've seen, agrarianism, the problem of reform, especially in Volhynia, that was also infiltrated by Soviet kind of guerrilla, etc., that fought against the Poles in the interwar period, etc., changed their mind often, right? Even in there, as today, lots of people everywhere do not really understand what, I don't know, the Soviet Union actually was, or what fascism actually was, what Nazism actually was. And so some of them would still pretend that after all, everything's fine, right? Let's just like it's happening. I mean, look at today's, I don't know, Putin's propaganda, all these things. There are people just, they live like shit, and they're really not really seeing much difference in the first place. But Poles, specifically at the time, could not forget what they had seen happening among these communities at the demolition of the Polish state, right? In many ways, both the Nazis and the Soviets, in part by some Ukrainians, had been greeted as liberators of some sort. And Ukrainian nationalists who joined in the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, there is all a chapter of this, starting from 1941. There were properly some units also of important size, but they got quickly disillusioned about what they thought, right? They realized the Nazis didn't give a damn about them. They were just a temporary aid, that they were considered an inferior race. So that's not really a condition for which you can give your life just simply, for the cause of anti-communism. And however, the fact that they had served with German uniforms would not be easily forgotten. This would inflate the further ethnic violence, and generally speaking, the idea of, you had sided with the Nazis, you had, this was, from the Polish side, seen an anti-Polish thing, of course, and in part, it also was in some ways, but again, it was not a total discriminate. It didn't work like that. In fact, Ukrainians were not the only ones who collaborated with the Nazis, especially if one considers, paradoxically, the same Eastern Poland, right? In those lands taken by the Soviet Union in 1939, and that had been occupied by Germany only in 1941. And it was obvious in these lands that after 2 years of Soviet rule that had showed, of course, what Soviet rule was actually about, many had all the reasons to receive the Germans that they didn't know up to that point, at least if not in wartime. They'd seen the German army back at the end of World War I, but it was a different thing. They would greet the Germans as liberators, right? And this is quite famous, as a matter of fact. There are plenty of documents showing this, and the expectations were natural in that regard, and that's exactly why, and this seems paradoxical or even provoking, but it's actually not, that in summer 1941 some Jews, as we were saying before, actually thought that they were happy that the Germans were coming, because they said, this, what we have lived in the under Soviet rule cannot be better than what happens under the Germans, right? It was so devastating. The Jews had arguably suffered of Soviet occupation more than anybody else. Collectivization had especially hit traders, small businessmen, so also probably the most active and productive elements of the population. Many of these people were Jews. And after all, the Germans had not yet begun the final solution that was decreed, as you know, at the Wannsee Conference at the end of 1942, just before the disaster of Stalingrad happened. And albeit this is overlooked, the Germans actually began to exterminate Jews in Germany since 1933 already, right? It didn't happen later. They began immediately, right? In smaller numbers with certain different procedures than the highly and mass scaled ones later on. But let's say nobody knew really at the time already that they were so broadly up to this. So not even the Jews knew, right? Some expected that, but the general understanding in these Eastern European areas of broader international issues was so vague in a way that they wouldn't even expect it. It could not be expected. And during Soviet occupation, thousands of Jews had actually even fled the Soviet rule for the German one, voluntarily. And it was hard to escape from there because the Soviets wouldn't let you. Now, among Poles in Galicia and Volhynia that were subject to the Soviets, in fact, between 1939 and 1941, collaboration with the Germans never had the same stigma as in Central and Western Poland, because the Soviet experience had blown these people's minds, including the Polish one, right? So it was understood more that given that the Red Army had occupied these lands that were prevalently ethnic Ukrainian, and that were brought down, was properly, especially in Volhynia, there was no such thing like middle class, right? There was just peasants. They had no means, no numbers. The Red Army marched in. I mean, they had numbers, but I mean, no means to oppose themselves. It was it, right? So they were obliged to cooperate with the Soviets. And so when eventually the Germans arrived, the end of the Soviet rule was so greeted that, okay, even cooperating with the Germans was kind of fine, right? Whereas in Central Western Poland, that was naturally a more developed area, and that the Poles were more, were first of all the prevalent ethnicity, and it was their home, they were their core land historically, and had not tasted yet Soviet totalitarianism. Even though they were perfectly aware that they didn't want to be under it, they had, however, just lived mostly the humiliation at the hands of the Germans, and so there was a much different paradigm there for which anybody at that point would cooperate with the Germans by, even though they kind of knew that the Soviets had sucked, but in their perspective, so, and also rightfully blinded by the hatred towards the invader, that they said, okay, whoever cooperates with the Nazis is just is more than just somebody who cooperates, is also doing it for anti-Polishness. And so, again, in part it was also true, but this, generally speaking, didn't reflect the majority of the situation up to that point. It was the same it was a fruit of the exasperation of ethnic rivalry that had taken place from the second half of the 30s onwards, and that had brought the Ukrainians and Poles to distance further, even before the most painful chapters of ethnic violence during the war that we will see in another video. Also, consider this, that the Germans maintained in control of Volhynia an important Polish element. We've seen how in this land, historically, at least before the ethnic tensions were revived later on, actually this was the land that even the Poles had seen properly as the least dangerous in terms of Ukrainian independentism. There was a greater assimilation historically of the Polish minority and the Ukrainian majority, and the properly the only at least the most important part of the local intelligentsia was made up of Poles. So there was literally at that point, even when the Germans arrived, they found already a situation where the Poles were in charge historically, and even though tensions had risen, they would keep them in control. In part, were also Ukrainians now participating to the administration, but it was a different story. So that's where the Nazis actually began to provoke tension themselves, artificially, on purpose. The idea was the more you keep them divided, the easier it is to rule them, which depends on the situation, frankly. And the twisted logic behind that was that they would hope they would, by putting them one against the other, that they would kill each other without having the same Nazis doing it, taking the to bother themselves to do it, right? It's a terrifying idea, and the same Soviet occupation actually had provoked conflict between Poles and Ukrainians in 1939, right? Especially because of the let's say divide existing between the Polish administrators and the Ukrainian peasantry. So at that point, the idea of the revolution in a Soviet sense was kind of more was weaponized in that direction of ethnic contrast, while the Nazis allowed a Ukrainian Central Committee to operate in Krakow. That, as you know, was Krakow was essentially that part of the former Habsburgic territories that had been paired with Galicia. Krakow was the original Polish capital in the Middle Ages. Eventually, was shifted to Warsaw in modern times. And it was, it's the second most important Polish city. It's an emblem of Polishness and so on. So the Nazis wanted to provoke and the Polish, the Poles were the majority, of course. So the Nazis wanted to provoke the Poles by establishing this Ukrainian institution in the city. Nominally, this was just a relief organization, but in practice was the quasi-official center of Ukrainian political life in general, right? In the whole Ukrainian community. So the members of the Central Committee wished to use the Nazis to remove Poles and Jews from what they thought was the Ukrainian ethnographic territory. So the ambition of nationalists Mark that had also historically gone beyond the territories that were in fact prevalently would have been just even as a criterion prevalently Ukrainian, like in the case of Krakow, for example. That wasn't, in fact. So in Volhynia, after 1941, the Nazis gave Ukrainians the chance to persecute Poles during the years 1941-1942. The Poles a chance actually to do the opposite in 1943-1944. And this was a mistake also from a military point of view for the Germans, because it would produce armed forces among both Poles and Ukrainians. It would begin to act, not just killing each other for that matter, but also killing the same Nazis as partisans. So this was kind of very weird, and in fact the same spread of Nazi ideology backfired in that regard, because this indoctrination in some instances brought paradoxically to the fueling of a local national identity opposed to the German rule. There were also attempts from the Nazis to colonize with German elements the Ukrainian-Polish borderlands near Zamość in 1942-1943, for which also there some ethnic cleansing was carried out, and in which in fact the Ukrainian Central Committee had an important organizational role that was in this sense instrumentalized by the occupiers in Ukrainian-Polish conflictual sense. So we'll see better in another video the different classifications were enacted also from a juridical point of view, like who were these people, like how could they distinguish each other, because we've seen that in some areas it was not particularly clear or important up to that point who was really Ukrainian or Pole, and of course there are also the Jews, etc. So we will see this in another video. For today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this one. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me, and see you next time. Bye.